Hello, my name is Eric Wilson. This is the third video in our series about 1914. And in this video, we're going to look at the scriptural evidence for 1914 to see whether there is a basis in the Bible to believe in this doctrine. This doctrine is so important to Jehovah's Witnesses that it is hard to imagine the organization without it. For example, core to our beliefs is the thought that we are in the last days, and that the last days began in 1914, and that the generation that will see the end of the last days began in 1914 and will end, or will not end, before Armageddon comes. But beyond that, there is the belief that the governing body was appointed by Jesus in 1919 to be the faithful and discreet slave, the channel by which God communicates with his flock on earth. If 1914 didn't happen, that is, if Jesus was not enthroned as the Messianic King in 1914, then there is no basis to believe that 5 years later, after his enthronement and subsequent inspection of the earth of his house, of the Christian congregation, that he settled on the group of Bible students which became Jehovah's Witnesses. There's no basis for that belief if he wasn't enthroned in 1914. So, in a sentence, no 1914, no 1919, no 1919, no governing body appointment as the faithful and discreet slave. No authority structure over the organization of Jehovah's Witnesses. No divine endorsement. That's how important 1914 is. Okay, so before we get into it, since we have decided we're going to examine the Bible exegetically, in other words, we're going to let the Bible interpret itself, let's not go into this discussion with a whole bunch of beliefs on our back. Rather, let's go in with a clear mind, and we're going to read the verses that are used to support the 1914 doctrine and see if in those verses there is any basis for any such belief. Or perhaps more accurately, we'll say as we read those verses, we will determine what they say to us. What is the Bible saying? How does it speak with regard to that prophecy? Now, the prophecy is found in Daniel chapter 4, the whole chapter. But to give you a little historic background, this is a vision or dreams of the night that the king of the world empire at that time, Babylon, received, and they disturbed him very much. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, and he had conquered Jerusalem. He had done what no king had done in 1,000 years of existence of the nation of Israel. Since Moses founded the nation until that time, no king had conquered it to the extent that he had done, subjugating it, destroying the capital, destroying the temple, and taking all the people off the land, leaving it desolate. The previous world power, Assyria, had tried to do something like that. Sennacherib came against them. King Hezekiah, the king of Judah at the time, prayed to God, and Jehovah God gave them salvation in the form of one angel who decimated the army of the Assyrians. 185,000 soldiers were killed in one night, and Sennacherib, fleeing back to his country, tail between his legs, had to admit defeat. So now comes Nebuchadnezzar, and no such thing happens to him. He conquers the nation of Israel, takes them all into Babylon. So he's beginning to think a little too much of himself. And this has to be dealt with. So as we read Daniel 4, we'll start with verse 10. In the visions of my head, this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking, in the visions of my head, while on my bed, I saw a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was enormous. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached the heavens, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit was abundant, and there was food on it for all. Beneath it the beasts of the field would seek shade, and on its branches the birds of the heavens would dwell, and all the creatures would feed from it. As I viewed the visions of my head while on my bed, I saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from the heavens. He called out loudly, "Chop down the tree, cut off its branches, shake off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from beneath it, and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground, with a banding of iron and copper. Among the grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of the heavens, and let its portion be with the beasts among the vegetation of the earth. let its heart be changed from that of a human, and let it be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over it. This is by the decree of watchers, and the request is by the word of the holy ones, so that people living may know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that he gives it to whomever he wants, and he sets up over it even the lowliest of men. Now he's relating this to Daniel, and Jehovah God, as part of this humiliation indeed of this king, requires him to go to one of his people, one of the Israelites, to get the interpretation. None of the Babylonian magic practicing priests can interpret it, but Daniel can. So right away, he's forced to recognize the authority of God. Daniel gives him the interpretation. But notice the point of the vision is stated right in the vision, that people living may know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of the heavens and that he gives it to whomever he wants. In other words, Jehovah is saying, you think you're something, Nebuchadnezzar, because you conquered my people? I let you conquer my people. You were a tool in my hands. They needed to be disciplined. I used you. I can take you down. I can put you back up. Anything I want, I can do. So he's showing this man exactly who he is and where he stands. And it's not where Nebuchadnezzar imagines he is. So Daniel gives the interpretation. We're going to skip a little bit simply because there's a lot here and our time is limited, but I would recommend you read the entire chapter carefully, meditatively, and prayerfully to see how it speaks to you. What is it actually saying? You will notice as you read it that this key point about the Most High being the ruler in the kingdom of mankind is repeated 3 times for emphasis. So in verse 20, Daniel says, "The tree, it is you, O king, because you have grown great and become strong, and your grandeur has grown and reached to the heavens, and your rulership to the ends of the earth." So who is the tree? It's the king. It's Nebuchadnezzar. Is there anyone else? Does Daniel say there's a secondary fulfillment? There's another king? No. One fulfillment he gives. Verse 33 jumps ahead to the time a year later when this prophecy was fulfilled. In verse 33 of Daniel 4 we read, "At that moment the word was fulfilled on Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven away from mankind." Now what was the moment? If we read the previous verses, he was walking around in his palace boasting to himself of how wonderful he was, and then a voice from heaven said, "Aha, now you'll find out." Not exactly in those words. So he was driven away from mankind, going back to verse 33, and he began to eat vegetation just like the bulls, and his body became wet with the dew of the heavens until his hair grew long, just like eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. That's interesting to include that. He was driven mad for 7 times. Now, witnesses believe this was 7 years. But in Hebrew, the word that's translated there, times, can mean seasons. It can mean periods of time. It isn't always a one-for-one relationship with year. And if it is, are we talking lunar year, solar year, prophetic year? A lot of vagueness there. It's not really important. It was just a significant period of time. If it was seasons, then you've got spring, summer, fall, winter, or sometimes rainy season, dry season, depending what part of the world you're in. Whatever it was, his hair grew long enough that it was matted together like eagle's feathers. Now, eagle's feathers are about 15 to 18 inches long. So assuming average hair growth, assuming the long hair that they wore in those days, after a couple of years, or about 7 seasons, his hair would grow to that length. Now, it's not conclusive. Could have been 7 years, and his hair could have stopped growing after 2. But anyways, it gives us some indication that there is ambiguity. We cannot say for certain that a time is a year. Okay, carrying on in verse 34. "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to the heavens, and my understanding returned to me, and I praised the Most High, and to the one living forever I gave praise and glory, because his rulership is an everlasting rulership, and his kingdom is for generation after generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are regarded as nothing, and he does according to his own will among the army of the heavens and the inhabitants of the earth, and there is no one who can hinder him or say to him, 'What have you done?' Verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of the heavens, because all his works are truth and his ways are just, and because he is able to humiliate those who are walking in pride. So if you look at those verses, do you see any indication of a secondary fulfillment? What is the purpose of this prophecy? Why was it given? It was given to make a point, not just to Nebuchadnezzar, who needed to be humiliated because he had conquered Jehovah's people and thought it was all him, but also for all humans and all kings and all presidents and dictators, and you name it, to understand that they serve at the pleasure of God. He allows them to serve because it is his will to do so for a period of time, and when it's no longer his will or his desire to do so, he can take them out in a fraction of a second, just as he did to Nebuchadnezzar. And he can put them back if he wants to as well. And he did it just this way because if he'd just gone mad, anybody could have said, oh, he went mad. People go mad. Or even somebody could have maybe attacked him and poisoned him to get him out of the way, to take over his rule. But no, he went mad just for the same length of period he was told he would go do so, and then he was restored, something which didn't happen in those days. When the king was down, all the ones with ambition took over. But no, his place was held for him. Remarkable. That's what God said would happen, and that's exactly what happened. Okay. So, now the reason I keep asking, do you see any future fulfillment in this, is because for 1914 to factor in, we have to look at this prophecy and say there is a secondary fulfillment, or as we say, an antitypical fulfillment. This was the type, the minor fulfillment, and the antitype, the major fulfillment, is the enthronement of Jesus, the lowliest of man. And it does mention the lowliest of man. He died on a stake. He died in the most lowly and weak of consequences or circumstances. And then he was raised to be the king over all things. All authority was given him in heaven and earth. Matthew 28:18. So, it could apply to that, but all we can really take from this is that at best we have an object lesson that applies to all kings, including Jesus. But is it more than that? Is it a time calculation? Well, there is nothing here to indicate that. There's nothing applied in Scripture to indicate this has a secondary fulfillment. Why is that important? That's very important because according to David Spillane, if we don't have an antitypical application established in Scripture, then we don't have an antitypical application at all. And to imply that there is one is to go beyond what is written. Here are his words.
Who is to decide if a person or an event is a type if the Word of God doesn't say anything about it? Who is qualified to do that? Our answer? We can do no better than to quote our beloved brother Albert Schroeder, who said, "We need to exercise great care when applying accounts in the Hebrew Scriptures as prophetic patterns or types, if these accounts are not applied in the Scriptures themselves." Wasn't that a beautiful statement? We agree with it. Well, in recent years, the trend in our publications has been to look for the practical application of Bible events and not for types where the Scriptures themselves do not clearly identify them as such. We simply cannot go beyond what is written.
Okay, so we have to make an assumption. We have to make an assumption that this is an exception to that rule, one assumption. Now, you know how dangerous assumptions are. If you have a chain and one link is made of paper and the rest are steel, the chain isn't as strong as the steel links. It's only as strong as the paper link. A chain is always as strong as its weakest link. And we already have one assumption, which, if wrong, causes the whole chain to come apart. But as you'll see as we go through this consideration, there are almost 24 links that are made of paper. Assumptions. Almost 24 assumptions. We have to assume something to be so for the interpretation of this prophecy to work in an antitypical fulfillment. So what are some of these assumptions? Well, the next one is taken from Acts 1, 6 and 7. Let's have a look at that. At Acts 1, 6, it reads, "This is why the disciples asked Jesus, 'Are you restoring the kingdom of Israel at this time?'" Now, this happened just as Jesus was about to be taken into heaven. And they think, now that he's resurrected and he's powerful, that he's going to restore the kingdom of Israel. What is the kingdom of Israel? This is the kingdom of the Davidic throne. And Jesus is said to be the Davidic king. He sits on the throne of David. And the kingdom of Israel in that sense was Israel itself. They didn't understand that there would be a spiritual Israel that would go beyond the natural Jews. But they were asking, are you restoring it at this time? And the important thing is his answer, which comes in the next verse. He said to them, "It does not belong to you to know the times and seasons that the Father has placed in his own jurisdiction." Now hold on just a moment. If the prophecy of Daniel was intended to give us an accurate, almost to the month, indication of when Jesus would be enthroned on the throne of Israel, on the Davidic throne, why did he say this? Why wouldn't he say, well, if you want to know, look at Daniel. I've already told you before, look at Daniel and let the reader use discernment. So go back and look at Daniel. And of course, they could have gone into the temple and found out exactly when this prophecy would have started, because they had the actual chronology of everything that had happened laid out in written form in the archives. So they could have done a simple calculation and said, oh man, you're not coming for like another 2,000 years. But he didn't say that. He said, it doesn't belong to you to know. Well, that seems contradictory and almost dishonest, because there's a prophecy intended for them to know, and now he's telling them it doesn't belong to you. So how do we get around that? Well, as witnesses, we've made another assumption. We've said, well, it didn't belong to them, but it belongs to us. Okay, on what basis do we say that we're exempt from that injunction, that prohibition to know this particular time and season that Jehovah has put in his own jurisdiction? For that, we go back to Daniel. At Daniel 12, 1-2, we read, "During that time, Michael will stand up, the great prince, who is standing in behalf of your people." Now, we believe that the great prince here is Jesus Christ, that Michael, the archangel, is Jesus Christ. There is a reason to doubt that, but that's another discussion we won't get into. Carrying on, "And there will occur a time of distress such as has not occurred since there came to be a nation till that time. And during that time, your people will escape, everyone who is found written down in the book. And many of those asleep in the dust of the earth will wake up, some to everlasting life, and others to reproach and everlasting contempt. And those having insight will shine as brightly as the expanse of heaven, and those bringing the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. As for you, Daniel, keep the word secret and seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will rove about, and the true knowledge will become abundant." Aha! This applies to the last days, and we're in the last days. Well, now the problem with that is, we believe we're in the last days because we have 1914 as our core doctrine. But isn't that circular reasoning? This must apply because we're in the last days. And how do we know we're in the last days? Because we know that 1914 is true. And how do we know that 1914 is true? Because of our interpretation of these verses applying to us in the last days. That's circular reasoning. Let's go back and let the Bible speak for itself. Going back to verse 1. It says, "The great prince standing in behalf of your people." So here's Daniel. And the angel says to him, there's a great prince standing in behalf of your people. Who's he going to think? Oh, yes, because in 2,500 years, there's going to be a group called Jehovah's Witnesses that are my people. No. Or there's going to be a group of Christians in 500, 600 years that are going to be spiritual Israelites. They're my people. He would have understood it to mean his people, the Jews. Would that be reasonable? Well, it's certainly evident from this, without introducing any kind of weird reasoning. He's talking about Daniel's people. It says, there will occur a time of distress such as not occurred since there came to be a nation until that time. Does that sound familiar to you? Let's go to Matthew 24. At Matthew 24:21 we read, for then there will be great tribulation such as has not occurred since the world's beginning until now, no, nor will occur again. That sounds eerily similar to the words spoken to Daniel about this time of distress. And in the Hebrew scriptures, you don't find the word tribulation, but the same word that is translated tribulation in English when we're translating from the Greek is often translated distress in Hebrew and translating from the Hebrew. The two words in Greek and Hebrew carry the same idea of tribulation or distress. And so here you have two parallel verses. Jesus is clearly speaking, all we have to do is read the context from verse 15 on, of Jerusalem and of Judea, Daniel's people, the Jews. So far, we haven't found any way to bring this forward to our day. Now going back to Daniel 12, the third part of the first verse, and during that time, your people will escape everyone who is found written down in the book. Let's go forward back to Matthew 24:16 this time. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Again, who is fleeing to the mountains? The Jews who are in Jerusalem, the Christianized Jews, the ones who understood Jesus' words and fled. Everyone written down in the book will escape. So far, we're still in the first century. Daniel 12:2. And many of those asleep in the dust will wake up, some to everlasting life, and others to reproach and to everlasting contempt. Okay? Is he talking literally about a literal resurrection? We want to stay in the context. We want everything to harmonize. Okay, looking again at Matthew 8:22 this time, we find Jesus saying the following words. Keep following me and let the dead bury the dead. Literal dead cannot bury the dead. He's talking about spiritual dead, those who are dead in their sins. Romans 6:13. But present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead. Again, the dead is dead in a spiritual sense. Christians are alive from the dead. They have woken up. They have been declared righteous. And as being declared righteous, when they die, they are immediately placed in that category where upon resurrection, they are given immortal life. So they have awoken from the dead, just as Daniel was promised. Now let's look at Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. And those having insight will shine as brightly as the expanse of heaven, and those bringing the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. This is what we think applies to us, that in the 19th century, many began to wake up and began to shine brightly. Well, that's true, but is that what Daniel is talking about? Did this happen in the first century? Matthew 5:14 says, you are the light of the world. 5:16 says, let your light shine before men. Now we get to the really neat scripture, the one that is used to try to support the idea that only in our century was the injunction against understanding the times and the seasons of God lifted. Daniel 12:4. And as for you, Daniel, keep the word secret and seal up the book until the time of the end. Many will rove about, and the true knowledge will become abundant. Aha, well, it's got to apply to our day because we're in the time of the end. Hold on. Acts 2:14 says, this is Peter talking, but Peter stood up with the 11 and spoke to them in a loud voice. Men of Judea and all you inhabitants of Jerusalem, let this be known to you and listen carefully to my words. These people are, in fact, not drunk as you suppose, for it is the third hour of the day. What is he talking about? He's talking about the Christians who had been anointed with Holy Spirit and were speaking in tongues. On verse 16 says, on the contrary, this is what was said through the prophet Joel, and in the last days, God says, I will pour out some of my spirit on every sort of flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams, and even on my male slaves and on my female slaves, I will pour out some of my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. Well, that sounds a lot like roving about, doesn't it? And that's exactly what they were doing. They were roving about in the scriptures. The true knowledge had become abundant. The sacred secret had been revealed. Jesus revealed the sacred secret. Colossians 1:26 and 27 says, the sacred secret that was hidden from the past systems of things and from the past generations, which would include Daniel's generation, but now it has been made manifest to his holy ones, to whom God has been pleased to make known what are the glorious riches of his sacred secret among the nations. Colossians 2:2 and 3 says, with a view to an accurate knowledge of the sacred secret of God, namely Christ, carefully concealed in him are all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. All the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. John 15:15. I no longer call you slaves because a slave does not know what his master does, but I have called you friends, because all the things I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. So the true knowledge did become abundant in the first century. We don't have any more knowledge than they did. We have speculation, we have conjecture, we have interpretation, but actual knowledge of facts, it was all written down in the first century. No inspired writers have come forward since then to add to it. So far we're up to 10 assumptions. Would you like to hear them? Assumption number 1. Nebuchadnezzar's dream has a modern-day antitypical fulfillment. There's nothing in the Bible to indicate that. It goes against our current official teaching, and yet that is what we have to accept if we're going to accept 1914 and everything else that goes with it. That's a big assumption. Assumption number 2. The injunction at Acts 1:7, it does not belong to you to know the times and the seasons which the Father has put in his own jurisdiction, does not apply to Jehovah's Witnesses. That restriction from Jesus given to Christians is something that we're exempt from. Assumption number 2. Now, the third assumption. When Daniel 12:4 says, the true knowledge will become abundant, it includes knowledge hitherto restricted by God. So what we're saying is not only is true knowledge abundant, but even secrets that God has placed in his own jurisdiction are also now abundantly known. Assumption number 4. Daniel's people, referred to in the first verse of chapter 12, are not the Jews, but Jehovah's Witnesses. Assumption number 5. The Great Tribulation or Great Distress that Daniel 12:1 mentions does not refer to the destruction of Jerusalem, despite what Jesus said at Matthew 24. Assumption 6. Those who Daniel was told would escape does not refer to the Jewish Christians in the first century who escaped the destruction and great tribulation of that day. No, it refers to Jehovah's Witnesses at Armageddon. Assumption number 7. Again, back in Daniel chapter 12, in verse 1, it says, Michael will stand up. Michael did not stand up for the Jews in the last days. We have to assume that, just as Peter said, but he will stand up for Jehovah's Witnesses now. Assumption 8. First century Christians did not shine brightly and did not bring many to righteousness, as Daniel foretold. That applies to Jehovah's Witnesses. Assumption number 9. Daniel 12:2 speaks of many Jehovah's Witnesses who were asleep in the dust, waking up to everlasting life. It does not refer to the Jews in the first century getting the truth from Jesus and waking up to life. Assumption 10. Despite Peter's words, Daniel 12:4 does not refer to the time of the end of Daniel's people, the Jews. It does not refer to the time of the end that Peter spoke about at Acts 2. It refers to our day. Assumption 11. Daniel 12:1-4 has no first century fulfillment. The whole thing applies to our day. Now, there's more assumptions. We've got 11 so far. Now we're going to see what Jehovah's Witnesses explain regarding Daniel chapter 4. You'll find it in the appendix of what does the Bible really teach. We used to teach this as one of our principal teachings. Now we stick it in the appendix, and I hope most people won't notice. So looking at the appendix, the title is 1914, A Significant Year in Bible Prophecy. And in the introduction, the first paragraph says, decades in advance, Bible students proclaimed that there would be significant developments in 1914. What were these? And what evidence points to 1914 as such an important year? Now, it's true that Bible students did point to 1914 as a year in which there would be significant developments. But what developments are we talking about? What developments would you assume are being referred to? The conclusion of this appendix item says, just as Jesus predicted, his presence as Heavenly King has been marked by dramatic world developments, war, famine, earthquakes, pestilences. Such developments bear powerful testimony to the fact that 1914 indeed marked the birth of God's heavenly kingdom and the beginning of the last days of this present wicked system. Okay, so it is the presence of Jesus Christ enthroned that was foretold by these Bible students, proclaimed decades in advance. How many decades in advance? Well, William Miller, who was kind of the granddaddy of the Adventist movement, proclaimed that 1843 or 1844 would be the time in which Jesus came back, when he returned. He used everything from Daniel. He believed in the 2,520 years, the whole calculation. The only thing he got wrong, or shall we say the only thing in which he differed from us as Jehovah's Witnesses, was the start date. He thought it started with the capture of Manasseh, King Manasseh. And so he calculated from that date, and he came up with 1843, 1844. Of course, nothing happened in those years, and there was a great disillusionment. Nevertheless, other Adventists found this whole thing so intriguing, and they just reworked the start year. So along comes Nelson Barber, and he thinks that 1914 would be the beginning of the end. It would be the start of the Great Tribulation, not the presence of Christ. As a matter of fact, he believed 1874 was the year in which Christ was present invisibly in the heavens. He met up with Russell and convinced Russell of his chronology. Up to that point, Russell had been down on the whole idea of prophetic chronology, but his meeting with Nelson Barber stimulated his creative juices, and he grasped hold of this wonderful, intriguing decoding of Bible chronology. And even when Nelson Barber abandoned Jesus because he claimed that the ransom of Jesus did not occur, there's no value to Jesus' death as a ransom, which is kind of the definition of the Antichrist. But even then, although Russell cut off association with him, he held on to his doctrine and continued to preach that 1914 was the start of the Great Tribulation, not the start of Christ's presence. And in the Golden Age, in 1930, is the first reference I've been able to find in which that was changed. It is just a kind of a marginal, almost a throwaway statement by Judge Rutherford, the second president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, and he wrote, Jesus has been present since 1914. That's it. No explanation why. So that was the first time I've been able to find any record of a change. So to say that decades in advance, Bible students believe 1914 was a year that was significant in Bible prophecy is very misleading, especially when you add the conclusion, which clearly states that it was Christ's presence that began in 1914. The fact is, Bible students did not, none of them, predicted Christ's presence in 1914 prior to 1914. And the first time the Bible students are even mentioned as changing the date to 1914 for Christ's presence is 1930. Okay, so that statement then in the appendix, that's false. Is it a lie? You might say, well, a lie is kind of a strong word to use. But I'm not using it. Jared Loesch is. Let's listen to how he defines a lie.
A lie is a false statement deliberately presented as being true, a falsehood. A lie is the opposite of the truth. Lying involves saying something incorrect to a person who is entitled to know the truth about a matter. But there's also something that is called a half-truth. The Bible tells Christians to be honest with each other. Now that you have put away deceit, speak truth, wrote the Apostle Paul at Ephesians 4:25. Lies and half-truths undermine trust. A German proverb says, "Who lies once is not believed even if he says the truth." So we need to speak openly and honestly with each other, not withholding bits of information that could change the perception in the listener or mislead him.
So there you have it. We had the right to know something, but instead of telling us the thing we should had the right to know, it's hidden from us. And we are being misled to a wrong conclusion. By Jared Loesch's definition, we're being lied to. But here's something more interesting. If Russell and Rutherford received new light from God to help them understand that Daniel chapter 4 applied to our day, then so did William Miller, and so did Nelson Barber, and all the other Adventists that accepted this prophecy. There were thousands of them. So what we're saying is Jehovah revealed partial truth to William Miller, but he just didn't reveal the start date. He revealed the rest. And then, after many were disillusioned, he did it again with Barber, and then again with Russell. And again, there was great disillusionment when the accuracy of their prediction failed. Does that sound like a loving God who would reveal half-truths, knowing how he would deceive his followers by inspiring men to interpret something incorrectly? Or is that all with the men? You be the judge. Let's continue reading the Bible Teach Book. Now, the second paragraph explains more about how we understand this prophecy. As recorded at Luke 21:24, Jesus said, "Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations, the times of the Gentiles," King James Version, are fulfilled. Jerusalem had been the capital city of the Jewish nation, the seat of rulership of the line of kings from the house of King David. However, these kings were unique among national leaders. They sat on Jehovah's throne as representatives of God himself, 1 Chronicles 29:23. Jerusalem was thus a symbol of Jehovah's rulership. How and when, though, did God's rulership begin to be trampled on by the nations? Assumption number 12. Babylon and other nations are capable of trampling on God's rulership. This is ridiculous. Not only ridiculous, but we have proof that it's false. Right in Daniel chapter 4. And I look back on myself and think, how did I miss this? Look how often this is disproven in that one chapter. First, in vision, Nebuchadnezzar gets this message in chapter 4, verse 17. "This is by the decree of watchers, and the request is by the word of the holy ones, so that people living may know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of the heavens, that he gives it to whomever he wants, and he sets up over it even the lowliest of men." Doesn't seem like somebody's being trampled here. Then Daniel reiterates in verse 25. He says, "You will be driven away from among men, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field, and you will be given vegetation to eat just like bulls, and you will become wet with the dew of the heavens, and 7 times will pass over you, until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that he grants it to whomever he wants. Then by angelic decree, in verse 32, and from mankind you are being driven away. With the beasts of the field your dwelling will be, and you will be given vegetation to eat just like bulls, and 7 times will pass over you, until you know that the Most High is ruler in the kingdom of mankind, and that he grants it to whomever he wants. Then, finally, having learned his lesson, Nebuchadnezzar himself reiterates in verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to the heavens, and my understanding returned to me, and I praised the Most High, and to the one living forever I gave praise and glory, because his rulership is an everlasting rulership, and his kingdom is for generation after generation. And then again, 3 verses later in 37, Nebuchadnezzar says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of the heavens, because all his works are truth, and his ways are just, and because he is able to humiliate those who are walking in pride. 5 times it says very clearly that Jehovah is in charge and can do anything he wants to anybody he wants, even the highest king there is. And yet we say that his kingdom is being trampled on by the nations? I don't think so. Where do we get that? Well, we get it by cherry-picking one verse and then changing the meaning of it and hoping that everybody else looks only at that verse and accepts our interpretation. Assumption 13. Jesus was talking about Jehovah's rulership when he said the following words at Luke 21:24. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled. Aha! Jerusalem is Jehovah's rulership. Why don't we read the context? So let's go back to verse 20. Here's Jesus speaking. However, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, when you see Jehovah's rulership surrounded by encamped armies? No. The city, Jerusalem, surrounded by literal encamped armies, the Romans. Then know that the desolating of her, Jerusalem, the city, has drawn near. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Let those in the midst of her, Jerusalem, leave. They're not leaving Jehovah's rulership, they're leaving the city. And let those in the countryside not enter into Jehovah's rulership? No, the city. Because these are days for meting out justice in order that all things written may be fulfilled. Woe to the pregnant woman and those nursing a baby in those days, for there will be great distress on the land and wrath against this people. He's talking literally. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem, the city, will be trampled on by the nations until the appointed times of the nations are fulfilled. There's nothing in this to indicate a metaphorical application or a symbolic application. He's talking literally about the city. And it has been trampled on. Even today, when we have the nation of Israel, an independent sovereign state, and yet Jerusalem is still a disputed city, divided city, claimed by 3 major religions, the Jewish religion and the Jewish people, the Christian religion, and the Muslim religion, Islam, and they fight over it. It is still being trampled on to this day. Has to be. That's what Jesus said would happen, and his words cannot fail. Assumption 14. Jesus got the verb tense wrong. He doesn't say Jerusalem will continue to be trampled on, as if this has been going on for 600 years by that date. No, he speaks in the future tense. It will be trampled on. If you say something will happen, it means it's not happening now. But it's going to happen, and that's what he says. It will be trampled on. Well, we assume, no, he really meant it already has been trampled on and will continue. Assumption 15. Jesus' words apply to Daniel 4. When he says this, there's no indication he's talking about anything else than the prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem. But we're saying, oh no, he's referring back to Daniel. This has to do with Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Assumption 16. The appointed times of the nations began with the exile to Babylon. Where do we get that from? Let's look at Daniel again, but this time we're going to look at a different prophecy because we can learn something from this prophecy as we apply it to Daniel chapter 4. And this prophecy comes from the 9th chapter of Daniel. I'm going to read Daniel 9:24. There will be 70 weeks that have been determined upon your people and upon your holy city, in order to terminate the transgression and to finish off sin, and to make atonement for error, and to bring righteousness for times indefinite, and to imprint a seal upon vision and prophet, and to anoint the Holy of Holies. And you should know and have the insight that from the going forth of the word to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the leader, there will be 7 weeks, also 62 weeks. She will return and be actually rebuilt with a public square and moat, but in the straits of times. Okay, so from this we have 3 elements. An unknown span of time, 70 weeks. Everybody knows a week has 7 days, so you've got a fixed number of days, and a day for a year was something that they knew about from the time of Moses, because they walked around in the wilderness for 40 years because they failed after a 40-day sojourn into Canaan to show faith. So, a fixed time frame, but we also had a critical element, the start point. And the start point was clearly declared what it would be. It would be from when the word went forth to rebuild the walls. So Jews, many hundreds of years later, could go into the temple, look in the archives, and find out exactly when that word went forth, do the calculation. But the other element that exists here in Daniel is an endpoint. He tells us what will happen when these 70 weeks is up. Messiah would be there. So we have a start point, an event, we have an end point, another event, and we have a time frame, clearly defined in Scripture. And it was understood by the people. At Luke 3:15, when John appears, it says, "Now as the people were in expectation, and all were reasoning in their hearts about John, may he perhaps be the Christ?" Why were they in expectation? Because they knew the prophecy was being fulfilled. They could run the math. That was the whole purpose of it. They knew it at the time they had to know it. Okay, so if that's the way Daniel works, if that's the way Jehovah works through Daniel, when he wants to give us a calculation, did he do that in Daniel chapter 4? No. Assumption number 7. The 7 times are 7 prophetic years of 360 days each. Times is a vague term, and in Hebrew it can also mean seasons, as we've already discussed. So we have an ambiguous time period. Assumption number 18. The event marking the start of this time period was the exile of the Jews into Babylon. Nothing in the Bible says that this is the starting event for this. We're making an assumption. Assumption number 19. The start year was 607 BCE. Again, there's no historical basis for that. Assumption number 20. The event marking the end was an invisible presence. There's nothing in Daniel to say that when this alleged time period ends, Jesus will suddenly become king. It doesn't say that. Another assumption. Assumption 21. The presence of Jesus would be invisible. This is another one of those things where I look back and think, how did I miss this? Jesus gave us clear warnings, and I missed them. All of us missed them. Why? Well, we'll get into that why very soon. But let's look at what Jesus said to us. Matthew 24:23. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will perform great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the chosen ones. Look, I have forewarned you. Therefore, if people say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. "Look, he is invisibly present." That's what he's talking about. They can't show us Christ. They can say, he's out in the wilderness, or he's in an inner room, or he's invisibly present. He says, "For just as the lightning comes out of the east and shines over to the west, so the presence of the Son of Man will be. When the lightning flashes, does someone have to say, "Hey, the lightning flashed"? No, you saw it yourself. Who doesn't see lightning flashing in the sky? Even if you're inside your room with the windows shut and the curtains drawn, you'll still perceive the flash of lightning. That's how bright the light is. That's what he's saying. Nobody needs to tell you. You'll see it for yourself. Then he carries on. In verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will beat themselves in grief, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and great glory. Does that sound like an invisible presence to you? Why did we miss all this? 21 assumptions. Any one of them is enough to just bring the whole doctrine to the ground. Why do we miss it for so many years? Why do we preach it for so many years? Why did I do that? How did I miss that? Misplaced trust. And they still want us to do it. Here's what Jared Loesch said in the March broadcast.
But Jehovah and Jesus trust the imperfect slave who cares for things to the best of his ability and with the best of motives. Shouldn't we then trust the imperfect slave as well? To appreciate the extent of Jehovah's and Jesus' trust in the faithful slave, reflect on what he has promised its members. He has promised them immortality and incorruption. Soon, just before Armageddon, the remaining members of the slave will be taken to heaven. Since 1919 of our common era, the slave has been put in charge of some belongings of Christ. According to Matthew 24:47, when the anointed are taken to heaven, Jesus will at that point entrust all his belongings to them. Does this not reveal immense trust? Revelation 4:4 describes these resurrected, anointed as co-rulers with Christ. Revelation 22:5 says they will rule not only for 1,000 years, but forever and ever. What immense trust Jesus shows toward them. Since Jehovah God and Jesus Christ completely trust the faithful and discreet slave, should we not do the same?
Okay, so the idea is Jehovah trusts Jesus. Granted. Jesus trusts the governing body? How do I know? And if Jehovah gives Jesus something to tell us, we know that whatever Jesus tells us is from God because he does nothing of his own initiative. He doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't mislead us with false expectations. So if Jesus gives this stuff to the governing body, what happens in transit? Missed communication, garbled communication, what happens? Or is Jesus just not very effective as a communicator? Or maybe he's not giving it to them. They want us to trust them. They say, trust us because Jehovah trusts them and Jesus trusts them. Okay, so I have their word for that. But then I have Jehovah telling me at Psalm 146:3, do not put your trust in princes. And that's what they claim to be. In this very broadcast, he claims to be a future king. Do not put your trust in princes nor in a son of man who cannot bring salvation. So, trust us, we bring salvation. If you listen to us, you'll be saved. Do not trust in princes who cannot bring salvation. You choose. The sad thing for me was when I discovered that 1914 was a false doctrine. I didn't lose my trust in the organization. I lost my trust in these men, but to be honest, I never really had that much trust in them anyways as men, having seen the many failures. But I believed that the organization was Jehovah's true organization, the one true faith on earth. It took something else to convince me to look elsewhere. And I'll leave that for the next video. Thank you very much for joining me. Until the next time.